In March of the year 1815, the most famous, most brilliant and most feared man in the world did the impossible. He was supposed to be a prisoner, a defeated monarch living out his days in quiet exile on the tiny Mediterranean island of Elba. But Napoleon Bonaparte was not a man who did anything quietly. He slipped past his guards, boarded a small ship, and landed on the coast of France with a handful of followers. The age of Napoleon was supposed to be over, but Napoleon was back. For a period that would go down in history as the 100 Days, he would try to reclaim his empire, his glory, and his destiny. It would all come down to a single bloody Sunday, in a series of muddy fields in what is now modern-day Belgium. The Battle of Waterloo is a name that echoes through history, a synonym for total and final defeat. The story is often told as a simple, heroic tale. The steadfast British and their allies, under the command of the brilliant but cautious Duke of Wellington, held on by a thread against Napoleon's ferocious attacks, until the Prussian army, led by the fiery old Field Marshal Blücher, arrived at the last possible moment to save the day. But the real reason Napoleon lost at Waterloo is not a simple story. It's far more complex, more tragic, and more human than the legends suggest. It's a story of torrential, world-altering rain, of catastrophic command decisions made by flawed and exhausted men, of immense personal courage on all sides, and of the agonizing slow-motion decay of a military genius who, for one fateful day, was tragically outplayed by his own limitations and by the sheer bloody-minded determination of his enemies. The road to Belgium, Napoleon's return to France, was one of the most remarkable episodes of his life. The Bourbon king, who had been restored to the throne, Louis XVI, was unpopular. The French army, which had conquered Europe under Napoleon's command, was resentful of the new monarchy. As Napoleon marched north from the coast, the armies sent to arrest him simply melted away, or more often, flocked to his banner. The most legendary moment came on the road to Grenoble. There, the 5th Infantry Regiment blocked his path. Napoleon, in an act of supreme theatrical courage, dismounted, walked towards them alone, and opened his greatcoat, declaring, "Soldiers of the 5th, I am your emperor. If there is any man among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." The soldiers, with tears in their eyes, threw down their arms and erupted in cheers of "Vive l'Empereur!" With that, his path to Paris was clear. He had reconquered France without firing a single shot. While the French people may have welcomed him back, the crowned heads of Europe reacted with unified and absolute horror. They had just spent over a decade fighting a series of brutal wars to contain this man, and they had no intention of doing it again. At the Congress of Vienna, where they were busy redrawing the map of Europe, the news of Napoleon's escape landed like a bombshell. They immediately ceased their squabbling and united against their common enemy. On March 13, 1815, they issued a stunning declaration. Napoleon Bonaparte was an outlaw, an enemy and disturber of the tranquility of the world. They formed the 7th Coalition, a massive military alliance between Great Britain, Prussia, Austria and Russia, all pledging to raise huge armies to destroy him once and for all. Napoleon understood his situation perfectly. He was a brilliant strategist, and he knew he was catastrophically outnumbered. The coalition could eventually field an army of over 700,000 men, a force he could not possibly hope to defeat. His only chance, his only hope, was to follow the strategy that had brought him so much success in the past, to strike first, to move with lightning speed, and to defeat his enemies in detail one by one before they could unite their overwhelming forces. His immediate targets were the 2 coalition armies closest to the French border, the ones massing in Belgium. The first was a multinational Anglo-Allied army of about 110,000 men, commanded by Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. The second was a battle-hardened Prussian army of over 120,000 men, under the command of the fiery 72-year-old Field Marshal Gebhard von Blücher. These 2 armies were spread out over a wide area, protecting the road to Brussels. Napoleon's plan was a classic of maneuver warfare. He would secretly and rapidly move his own army, the Armée du Nord, to the border, drive a wedge between Wellington and Blücher, and then use his superior numbers in a localized area to crush each army separately before the other could come to its aid. It was a brilliant and audacious plan, and on June 15, 1815, it began with stunning success. The first cracks. The seeds of Napoleon's ultimate defeat at Waterloo were not sown on that bloody Sunday. They were sown in the two chaotic and confusing days that preceded it, on the battlefields of Ligny and Quatre Bras. On June 15th, Napoleon's army crossed the Sambre River at Charleroi, achieving near-perfect strategic surprise. He had successfully driven his army directly into the hinge point between the Prussian and Anglo-Allied forces. The initiative was his. The next day, June 16th, he moved to engage both enemy armies simultaneously. He personally took command of his main force and marched to attack the Prussians, whom he had located at a village called Ligny. At the same time, he ordered his most famous and trusted subordinate, Marshal Michel Ney, to take the left wing of the army and seize the vital crossroads of Quatre Bras. This would prevent Wellington from reinforcing the Prussians and would position Ney to swing in and crush the Prussian flank, ensuring their total annihilation. This is where the first cracks in the French war machine began to appear. At Ligny, Napoleon engaged Blücher's Prussians in a brutal head-on slugging match. The fighting was ferocious, with villages changing hands multiple times. In the end, Napoleon's tactics won the day. A final massive assault by his elite Imperial Guard shattered the Prussian center, and Blücher's army was defeated. But it was not the decisive, annihilating victory Napoleon had needed. The Prussians, though badly battered and forced to retreat, were not destroyed. They managed to withdraw from the battlefield in relatively good order, a fact that would have monumental consequences 2 days later. Meanwhile, a few miles to the west, Marshal Ney's battle at Quatre Bras was a disaster of indecision and missed opportunities. Ney, famously known as the bravest of the brave, was a superb battlefield commander, but was often lost when required to act independently on a strategic level. He was uncharacteristically hesitant. He failed to seize the crucial crossroads early in the day, when it was only lightly defended. This delay allowed Wellington to pour reinforcements into the position. Ney's attacks, when they finally came, were poorly coordinated and were repulsed. He not only failed to take the crossroads, but he also failed to detach a corps under General d'Erlon to assist Napoleon at Ligny, a move that could have turned the Prussian defeat into a complete rout. The day ended with Wellington holding the crossroads and the French left wing exhausted. The following day, June 17th, Napoleon made what was arguably his most fatal decision of the entire campaign. Wellington, having learned of the Prussian defeat at Ligny, began to withdraw his own army north towards a defensive position he had already scouted, a low ridge just south of the village of Waterloo. Napoleon, now focused on Wellington, needed to ensure that the retreating Prussians could not recover and march to Wellington's aid. To accomplish this, he detached a significant portion of his army, over 33,000 men and 96 cannons, roughly a third of his total force, and placed it under the command of Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy. His orders to Grouchy were fatally ambiguous. He told him to pursue the Prussians, to keep them at his sword's point, and to prevent them from rejoining Wellington. But he failed to give Grouchy clear contingent instructions. What if the Prussians didn't retreat east, towards their homeland, as Napoleon assumed they would? What if they made the daring decision to retreat north, parallel to Wellington's army, in order to link up with him? Napoleon's vague orders did not account for this possibility, and he had placed their execution in the hands of a marshal who, while competent, was methodical and utterly lacking in the kind of strategic initiative the situation required. This decision to split his army, to send a third of his men on a wild goose chase after an enemy whose intentions he had misjudged, would come to haunt him. As the French army pursued Wellington north on the 17th, the heavens opened. An apocalyptic thunderstorm of almost biblical proportions erupted over the Belgian countryside. The rain fell in sheets, turning the roads into impassable rivers of mud and the fields into a thick, sodden quagmire. The storm soaked every soldier to the bone, ruined their gunpowder, and extinguished their campfires. But most importantly, it saturated the battlefield of Waterloo. This was not just a case of bad weather. The rain was now a major tactical factor, and it had just stolen Napoleon's most precious and dwindling resource, time. A Sunday of mud and blood. The battlefield of Waterloo was not chosen by Napoleon, it was chosen by Wellington, and it was a work of quiet, defensive genius. The Duke had selected a low ridge that ran from west to east. The key feature of this ridge was its reverse slope. By placing the majority of his infantry on the backside of the ridge, hidden from view, Wellington could protect them from the devastating fire of Napoleon's famously superior artillery. The French gunners would be firing blind, unable to see their primary targets. Wellington also expertly anchored his defensive line on 3 fortified farm complexes that stood in front of his main position. On his right flank was the large and formidable Château of Hougoumont, a collection of stone buildings, gardens and walls. In the center of his line was the smaller but crucial farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte, which sat right on the main road, and on his left flank was the hamlet of Papelotte. Wellington garrisoned these farms with some of his best troops, turning them into formidable strongpoints that would have to be taken before any assault on his main line could succeed. He had prepared his killing ground. Napoleon's first defeat of the day came from the weather. He rose early on the morning of Sunday, June 18th, intending to begin his attack at dawn. But as he surveyed the battlefield, he saw that the torrential rain had turned the ground into a deep, clinging mud. This was a disaster for his artillery, the arm of the army he relied on to blast holes in the enemy's line. The heavy cannons could not be easily moved into position, and when they fired, the cannonballs would simply bury themselves in the soft earth instead of skipping across the ground and causing maximum casualties. Against the advice of some of his commanders, Napoleon made the fateful decision to delay the start of the battle until the ground had a chance to dry. The main attack did not begin until around 11:30 a.m. This delay of 4 to 5 hours was a priceless gift of time to the Prussians, who were now on a desperate forced march to join Wellington's army. The battle began not with the main assault, but with a massive diversionary attack on the Château of Hougoumont on Wellington's right flank. This was intended to draw in Wellington's reserves, weakening his center for the real attack to come. But the attack on Hougoumont became a bloody, obsessive battle within a battle. The Allied defenders fought with incredible tenacity, and Napoleon fed more and more French troops into the fight, a mincing machine that would consume thousands of his best soldiers for the entire day without ever achieving its strategic goal. Around 1:30 p.m., the main French assault began. The Grand Battery of over 80 French cannons opened fire, and a corps of 18,000 French infantrymen under the command of General d'Erlon advanced on Wellington's left center. The initial attack was successful, pushing back the Dutch and Belgian troops on Wellington's front line. But as the French crested the ridge, Wellington unleashed his counterattack. The British heavy cavalry, including the legendary Scots Greys, charged down the slope and smashed into the French infantry columns, shattering the assault. But in their excitement, the British cavalry charged too far, and they were in turn destroyed by a countercharge from French lancers and cuirassiers. The next phase of the battle was perhaps its most iconic, and for the French, its most tragic. Around 4 p.m., Marshal Ney, observing a movement of Allied troops behind the ridge — Wellington was actually just reorganizing his line — mistook it for the beginning of a general retreat. Without orders from Napoleon, Ney launched a series of massive, unsupported cavalry charges against the Allied center. It was a spectacle of terrifying grandeur. For nearly 2 hours, wave after wave of up to 10,000 of France's elite heavy cavalry, the cuirassiers in their steel breastplates and the dragoons of the Imperial Guard, charged up the muddy slope. But they were charging into a wall of bayonets. Wellington's infantry had formed into defensive squares. These squares were nearly unbreakable by cavalry alone. The French horsemen swirled around them, firing pistols and slashing with sabers, but they could not break the disciplined volleys of musket fire. It was an act of incredible bravery, but it was tactical madness, a catastrophic waste of France's irreplaceable elite cavalry against an enemy they could not break. While the cavalry charges were failing, a desperate, close-quarters struggle was taking place for the farmhouse of La Haye-Sainte. For hours, the German defenders held out, but eventually they ran out of ammunition. The French finally captured the farmhouse late in the afternoon. This was the moment of greatest crisis for Wellington. The French now controlled a strong point at the very center of his line and could bring up artillery to blast his defenses apart. His line was on the verge of breaking. But just as this crisis was unfolding, a new threat appeared on the horizon to the east. It was the Prussians. The leading elements of Bülow's corps, the first of Blücher's army to arrive, began to attack Napoleon's right flank. Napoleon, who had been focused entirely on Wellington, was now forced to fight a second battle. He had to commit his precious reserves, including battalions of his young and old guard, to hold off the growing Prussian threat. The pressure was now on him. He had to break Wellington, and he had to do it now. Around 7:30 p.m., Napoleon played his last card. He gathered the last of his uncommitted reserve, the legendary veterans of the Middle and Old Guard, and launched them in a final desperate assault on Wellington's battered centre. This was the moment of decision. The Imperial Guard had a reputation for being invincible. They had never been defeated in a direct assault. As they marched up the ridge, a wave of disciplined elite soldiers, the entire French army paused to watch, expecting them to deliver the final victorious blow. But Wellington was ready. He had reinforced his centre, and he had his own elite guardsmen lying down on the reverse slope, hidden from view. As the French guard crested the ridge, Wellington reportedly shouted, "Now, Maitland! Now's your time!" The British foot guards stood up and delivered a series of devastating, point-blank volleys into the flank of the advancing column. The attack faltered. Another Allied brigade assaulted their other flank. The Invincibles were stopped cold. For the first time in their history, they began to fall back. The cry went up throughout the French army, a sound of pure disbelief and despair. "La garde recule!" The guard retreats. It was the psychological breaking point. The army's will was broken, and the retreat quickly turned into a full-blown, panicked rout. The anatomy of a defeat. As the French army collapsed, Blücher's Prussians finally broke through on the right flank and crashed into the fleeing soldiers. Wellington, seeing the rout, stood in his stirrups and waved his hat in the air, the signal for a general advance. The long, bloody day was over. The Prussian cavalry, filled with a burning hatred for the French after their defeat at Ligny, pursued the fleeing army relentlessly through the night, giving no quarter and turning the defeat into a total catastrophe. So, what was the real reason Napoleon lost? The truth is that there was no single reason. His defeat was not the product of one mistake or one moment of brilliance from his enemies. It was a cascade of failures, a perfect storm where his own weaknesses, the failures of his subordinates, and the genius and determination of his opponents all converged on one fateful day. First, there was Napoleon himself. There has been much debate over his physical health at Waterloo. He was suffering from what were likely hemorrhoids, making long hours on horseback painful. But more important than his physical condition was his command style. By 1815, he had become so accustomed to success and so reliant on his own genius that he had created a system where his marshals were often afraid to act without his explicit and detailed orders. His own brilliance had stifled the initiative of his subordinates. His decision to split his army and his vague orders to Grouchy were an uncharacteristic and ultimately fatal strategic blunder. Second, there were the catastrophic failures of his marshals. Marshal Ney, for all his legendary courage, was a poor independent commander during the campaign. His hesitation at Quatre Bras on the 16th was a major strategic failure. At Waterloo, his obsession with launching the unsupported cavalry charges was a tactical disaster that wasted the finest cavalry in the world. Marshal Grouchy, on the other hand, failed not by being reckless but by being too timid and too literal. As the cannons of Waterloo began to thunder on the afternoon of the 18th, his subordinate, General Gérard, famously begged him to march to the sound of the guns. A more intuitive commander might have done so. But Grouchy, clinging to his ambiguous orders to pursue the Prussians, refused. His lack of initiative and strategic imagination kept 33,000 desperately needed French soldiers out of the decisive battle. Third, we must give full and deserved credit to Napoleon's opponents. The Duke of Wellington fought a perfect defensive battle. His brilliant choice of battlefield, his masterful use of the reverse slope to protect his men, his calm and steady leadership throughout the day, and the incredible stubborn discipline of his multinational army were all absolutely critical to the victory. His army bent, but it never broke. And finally, there was the unbreakable promise of the Prussians. The contribution of Blücher and his army cannot be overstated. After being personally ridden down by cavalry, and nearly killed at Ligny, any other 72-year-old commander would have retreated. But Blücher was a man forged from iron. He rallied his defeated troops, ignored the advice of his more cautious staff, and drove them on a brutal forced march across muddy country roads with a single-minded purpose: to keep his promise to Wellington. Their arrival on Napoleon's flank was not just a bonus, it was the decisive, battle-winning factor. In the end, Napoleon's last gamble failed because, for perhaps the first time in his career, his own mistakes and the quality of his enemies combined to create a catastrophe from which even his legendary genius could not recover. It was the reign, his own hubris, the failures of his marshals, the genius of Wellington, and the iron will of Blücher, all coming together on a single bloody Sunday. The age of Napoleon, which had begun with a cannonade in the streets of Paris, ended in a field of mud, blood, and rain.